We're going to start with the first clip from the film Hot Coffee, and then Prudence will talk about her work on this particular documentary and how she dealt with all the archive material. So, we are ready.
Thanks for coming, and I hope this will be useful to you. Collectively, we represent a lot of decades of archival experience. So we're going to cover some of the concept and practices of professional archival research, how archive can enrich your film, some of the licensing issues, and most of all, how to approach the search for media. So whether you're making a biographical film or a more journalistic or advocacy film or an essay type film, archive is just one of the many elements to help you tell your story. So the clip we're going to look at first is from Hot Coffee, and when I first was asked to work on the film, I was a little concerned about how we were going to make the story visually compelling. It's a film made by a first-time filmmaker who spent 25 years as a personal injury lawyer and was appalled at how the American public was and is losing their access to the jury system. Now, that's a pretty abstract concept, and most people don't know that much about how the jury system really works. But many people had heard about the Hot Coffee case. In case you haven't, it was an older woman who sued McDonnell reluctantly because the coffee was too hot, and she suffered third-degree burns when it spilled on her. And she was awarded a large settlement. One of the reasons this was a perfect candidate for fair use, which you'll see a lot of clips in the beginning, is because the media played such a key role in misrepresenting the case and making her a victim a second time, ridiculing her in the press. So we're going to start, this is just the open of the film, and we can just take a look and we'll see how it goes. This was a first-time filmmaker, who went to Sundance the year before she started work on her film to learn how successful filmmakers, do in the marketplace. So, pretty confident. So, I'm just going to touch on a few of the main organizational issues and that affect how we set up a good archival research practice. The first one is budget. What can you afford? And because that determines what sources we can look at and where we can go. And there's wonderful public domains sources in government collections and in universities, and sometimes private collectors are very generous. And sometimes the producer can't tell you what the budget is, but you do need to have that kind of discussion, even if it's with yourself, about what the archival budget might be. Because you want to be strategic. It's like shopping for a banquet you're planning. You want to know that if there's some piece of footage that's going to cost a lot, that you have the money for that, and that you might want to save money on licensing some materials from cheaper sources, or making compromises on less important clips or photos. The other thing that's really critical is what reasonably is the audience you anticipate is appropriate for your film, and based on that, what rights do you think you'll need? It's nice to think that every documentary will be shown theatrically, but it's actually not that likely in the scheme of things, partly depending on the topic and partly depending on a host of other things. So it's good to be realistic. And another thing we do at the very beginning is create a timeline of your story. Not just linear necessarily, but sometimes context, like where your protagonist was or the main events. And also think laterally, like if your story takes place in the US and the subject is a female marathon runner, and breaking into the marathon, competitive running movement, what was happening elsewhere? Is she really the first, or did she go elsewhere? What else is happening in that time period? And we usually sit down at the very beginning, and that's the optimum time for us to come in on the project and discuss a wish list with the director. That's basically, a list that you both understand and with priorities. And last is I wanted to just run down really quickly the sort of organizational order, the schedule. The archive schedule has to fit into the production schedule. And often producers don't understand where we fit in and how long things take. So that's a really critical discussion to have right at the beginning. We develop a database of some kind, whether it's FileMaker or Google Docs or something, to track all the footage and all the media that we're bringing into the edit. And we do a first research pass that's pretty broad, and then often we come back and do subsequent much tighter research passes, more specific. And then before picture lock, we have to source everything, since a lot of things are, especially on YouTube, are impossible to source. We'll talk more about that later. So we sometimes have to find substitutes for footage in the film. And then we get to picture lock, and then we order masters and pay and sign agreements and confirm that everything is, correct. So those are the nuts and bolts of the process. So maybe I'll turn it back to you.
So maybe I can, we'd love to hear about your experience on long, strange trip, and just maybe ask with, maybe start with the question, how did you tackle this research for you guys? How did you organize your work? How did you, deal with, I don't know, I think you had more than 12,000 hours of footage, isn't it? No, yeah. Is it?
I think, well, actually we had, not 12,000 hours of archival footage, although it felt like that. It felt like that. Yeah. But we had almost 20,000 photos, which is amazing. I mean, it's also, the band was very well documented, so that helped a lot. But it was, there was a huge treasure trove of materials, and it really, I was on the project for 3 years, and Jim was on it almost as long as that as well. Jim and I worked together sourcing all this amazing footage, and speaking to what Prue had mentioned, really following the timeline, and also knowing the story, knowing what beats the director really wants to hit, and seeing where you have holes and trying to fill those in is super important. And I think that really directs you to what you need to find and where you need to go. But that's sort of like the bare bones of it. But really, it is very time intensive, and some projects last quite a few years because the subject is so well documented, like the Grateful Dead, or, and sometimes that the budget doesn't allow for that, but hopefully, you work on a project where you have the right amount of time to be able to do your best and find everything out there.
So you can also share your experience, Jim, on this film, and maybe just tell us a bit more about your role and.
Sure. So I came in about, I think, 8 months after Annie started. So they already had quite a bit of materials in-house already. We also had complete access to the Grateful Dead vault. One of the things that was tricky about the Grateful Dead vault is that while they had tons of material, they didn't necessarily own all that material. So a lot of it was a matter of trying to figure out who the owners were. And back to a point that both Prue and Annie made, is that the organization is really the key to organizing archive, especially when you have a project as big as the Grateful Dead project. We use FileMaker, which is an expensive program to use, but it is really the most effective database program out there right now. You can also use Microsoft Access, and I've done a number of programs in Google Docs. It's not quite as neat and clean, to say the least. But organization and being able to keep track of everything as your edit progresses is really, really important.
Okay, and Sorry, and you maybe Prue, you can just like talk about. I know that you work on I'm Not Your Negro. I know that there were some other archival producers. One of them was based in France, so maybe you can explain a bit the collaboration between also different archive researchers on the project and how did you manage to.
Well, I Am Not Your Negro was unusual because we didn't really collaborate. I was called in to find things they hadn't been able to access and a lot of the US material, but often we are collaborating. I work on a lot of French projects, and for a film about called Free to Run on the women in the marathon movement and sort of the growth of the whole competitive marathon movement over the last 50 years. The French researcher and I, basically divvied up the wish list. But of course, there's a lot of instances where the same footage is available in more than one place. So it was collaborating on, what we found and sort of checking off the list. But I do want to add one more thing, and that is the role of serendipity in doing research is one of the most exciting things and the most gratifying, because as we're looking for A, we're screening something very unusual that we weren't looking for pops up. And that can then influence the direction of the film. And I think the best producers are very open to that. So things are sometimes very badly or hardly at all logged in archives. It's not like the metadata is all there. Sometimes it's 2 words that describes, 60 minutes of footage. So it's very important to, collaborate with everybody on the team and sort of point out when you've stumbled onto something that happens to be great. And you probably have examples of that also.
Okay, so we can just maybe talk about a bit the pressure also of finding the unseen. This whole process to find and to have access to the most rare footage and never seen. And I wanted to know, I wanted to hear your experience about that and how you handle the research and lead the research to really find the unseen footage that your director, all the directors, they are looking for material, right? So I'd love to hear you. Jim?
The unseen?
Yeah. Unseen, sorry, unseen.
What would be the best one for the dead?
Maybe we can start with. We can see the clip? Yeah, definitely. And then we're going to talk. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this is a clip that we did find in the Grateful Dead vault. And it's on Hollywood Festival? Then you set this one up.
I'll set this one up. Awesome. We have 2 clips from the Grateful Dead, both of which are really great.
The first one is going to be the one of Ashbury. So
Yeah. So this one. This is when the Grateful Dead are they're living in a house in the Haight-Ashbury, and Long Strange Strip it's like 85-90% archival. It's a lot of archival, and I think that the pressure to find unseen footage on a band that is so well documented, and especially the fans are so enthusiastic that they've basically seen everything that is, so the pressure was pretty high, and so here you'll see some rare photos, contact sheets, and really close up, really early footage of the Grateful Dead performing, for a very small impromptu performance, and performing for a small audience.
I'd like to actually just throw something in. So the first section of footage in that sequence is from a documentary by CBS News called The Hippie Temptation, which I've used in a million different documentaries. It's an amazing piece. It was basically a profile of Haight-Ashbury in 1967. And the copy that CBS News had basically been distributing whenever you licensed material previously was from a original film chain transfer to 2-inch videotape from 1967. And one of the goals of this film was to have everything possible when we had film elements rescanned. So either to HD 2K and sometimes 4K. And when we got that new scan of the film, when we sent it to the editors, I remember getting an email from the editor freaking out because he said we got the wrong footage. And the footage looks so much better when you rescan it, because if you're dealing with an old SD copy from 2-inch quad videotape from 1967 versus a brand new 2K scan, you won't believe the difference. And if you have the budget for that, and most people will require you to deliver to HD at least, if not to 4K, you need to have the budget for that as well.
Yeah, and then speaking to the other pieces there that illustrate the rareness of the material, the contact sheets, those had not been seen. I don't think those had ever really been widely seen before. And that came from the fruition of doing a lot of research into people who were hanging out with the Grateful Dead, who were in the scene in San Francisco, but may not have been apparent before. I mean, I think that also part of the archival search is to always keep looking, even though you think you've found everything. Because I think both those pieces, the contact sheets, that photographer had tracked down sort of in the middle of production, and then the great close-ups, the color footage of them playing. Came from watching. It appeared in another documentary, but it had not been widely it had not been in the sort of Grateful Dead fans sort of realm, because I hadn't seen it before, and so it was in a lesser known documentary. But this filmmaker from San Francisco, who's an experimental filmmaker, he had captured them in Seattle, and it really hadn't been widely seen. So, and we also did a new film scan of that, which just came out beautifully. So,
okay.
And film scans are not cheap, so please make sure you have money to do film scans. Film is a dead media at this point, so there's, I think, only one lab left in New York City left that will do HD or 2K, 4K scans. There's a couple in New Jersey, but I mean, it's not like it used to be. It's really, it's expensive, and you have to have a lot of money to do that, especially if you have a lot of film, which we did.
So now me, I'm just always curious, because I'm passionate about archives obviously, and I'm always curious to hear what were your biggest Eureka moment on those films like that. Where did you find the gem you were looking for? What is really the moments where you say just my gosh, I found that and I'm super proud of that. Did you have those moments? I'm sure on those two beautiful movies. Prue?
I was thinking on the hot coffee film, it wasn't sort of one Eureka moment. We were very happy at the degree to which we were able to fair use all those clips in the beginning, and that's very expensive footage. Seinfeld and Homer Simpson and Andy Rooney, and that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars, and it was sort of a textbook fair use case, because the point was how the media had re-victimized the victim, and that's one of the criteria for fair use, is that you're making an editorial point in a transformative way. On another film I worked on called Free to Run, on the history of the marathon movement, I had a moment where we found the footage of Kathy Switzer getting physically dragged out of the 1967 Boston Marathon, which she'd entered legally using her initials. It was an all-male AAU race. And for 40 years, everybody used the stills, which are quite extraordinary, showing the race director yanking at her bib to try to throw her out of the race. And her boyfriend, who's also running, pushes the race director, and he goes flying to the side of the road. So I thought, okay, I'll look for it, but we didn't know it existed in film. And then it turned out, because they gave us time to look at film, which just was labeled Boston. It didn't say that there was any women in it. You never know what they're going to cover of a 3-hour race. I found the footage because the press truck happened to be by, and the press truck is where the race director came down and tried to push her off. So that footage had never been seen before, period. Kathy Switzer had never seen it, and so that was an exciting moment. And it was as she described it. You know, you never know. Sometimes people's memories are a little exaggerated, but he did physically try to, pull her down. So, anyway.
And you guys, I'm sure you have a lot to share.
Okay. One of the things we did on the Grateful Dead project, which I've done on a few projects, but nothing to quite the level, nothing will ever surpass the amount of, the volume of materials we had for the Dead project, is that we did an open call to Deadheads. So on the Grateful Dead website, we basically put up an ad saying, we're looking for your stuff. And basically, we asked them to email us a description of the material, not to actually email the material. And then we vetted all that and decided what we were actually interested in calling in. So that is really where we found some really unique gems. And one of the pieces that we did, we found a lot of people shot home movies on Super 8, and VHS and other things in the 80s, but Super 8 primarily in the 70s. And we dealt with a very unique gentleman who goes by a variety of different names, from Dr. Bob to Barf Bucket Bob to Santa Bob. But he had shot a number of home movies of the Dead performing in the early 70s, and I'm going to blank on which locations they were. Do you remember?
I think one was Santa Barbara yeah.
But this guy really knew what he was doing with a camera. He was an amazing filmmaker for being, I think he was 17 or 18 when he shot these, and he still does rock medicine, so he works at like Fish shows and other related type bands and so forth, doing rock medicine for people that overdose. But it was a long process dealing with some of these people who don't license footage. They're not familiar with the terms and how this all works and how they get paid, and are we giving you our rights forever and ever? Can we use these again, et cetera, which is not what we were asking for. But it was, his footage just sang, and particularly, we're not going to show a sequence from that, but he had probably the best footage I think we had, that hadn't really been seen, of the Wall of Sound, which was a giant stack of speakers that the Dead toured with for years. And that was kind of like when we got that, and then we also had that all rescanned to 2K, and it was just unbelievable to see that. So.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think there were a lot of Eureka moments with this film, because also we did have the luxury of having so much time and to really turn over every stone. And Jim found some of the pieces that were just, had evaded the director and myself for so many months. So, they're just those, it's a combination of people who aren't really, they're not vendors. And so you need to reach out to them, and you need to take the time to kind of coach them through the process and gain their trust. And I think that that's a big thing, is that people, and rightfully so, they don't know you. They don't know if you're going to be using their material for years and years in your film. So, gaining their trust and convincing them and reassuring them that it's in good hands, and that your film is worth having their material shown in it, and to have people see it. So.
Okay.
And not to badmouth Deadheads at all, but a lot of them have done a lot of drugs. And, I can remember one gentleman I spoke to probably for 2 hours, walking him through the process. And then after I thought we had got everything worked out, he called me back 30 minutes later and asked me to go through it again. So it's just, you have to have a lot of patience when you're not dealing with like a normal vendor or a specialty area like this. So it is definitely, the Dead was one of the most unique challenges I've ever worked on. So
I think we have clips to see. Yeah?
Ours?
Yeah. And then it's about tracking the right holders, etc.
Okay.
I think you have.
So this is a clip from the Hollywood Festival, which is actually in England, not in Hollywood. This was found in the Grateful Dead vault and had never been seen before. To give you a little bit of setup, because we're trying to keep the clips short, is one of the basic rules of dealing with the Grateful Dead is if they offer you something to drink and you don't want to be checked out for the next 48 to 72 hours, don't drink it. So we found that this film, it's amazing. It was probably a good hour of footage shot for a documentary in 1971. We knew that the BBC shot it, We knew that it was probably a work for hire by Warner Brothers Records for the BBC to make this while the Grateful Dead were doing their first tour abroad. But nobody will claim this film. The BBC had no records of it, wanted nothing to do with it. Warner Brothers had no records, wanted nothing to do with it. We have all the slates, so we can see the clapboards and names and so forth. We couldn't track down anybody for this. So this is an example of what we refer to as an orphan work. Nobody would claim the piece, and eventually the Grateful Dead basically said, we'll make a claim on it. But it was just an amazing piece of footage that we had to use. It's so really important to that early portion of the Grateful Dead's history, and it's a lot of fun too. So.
I know that there are a lot of young filmmakers also in the screening room, so maybe I would like to, what are your best advices to lead a successful archival production? Maybe we can just yeah.
Your turn.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, you need to have a realistic budget. So speaking to someone who has made an archival heavy film would be helpful, and to understand, I think to understand what you're dealing with, and, what's realistic for you in terms of an archival budget. It's always going to be more expensive than you think. And I would encourage, even despite that, if you have a small budget, really, look for the gems, and that means doing your diligence and research and finding maybe unconventional sources and unconventional vendors, because maybe they will be more open to working with you on pricing and all that. So.
The only thing I'd add to that is just the collaboration of the team is so essential. We work very closely with the editor and director, and the assistant editor is really critical because they're taking in the footage, and there just needs to be a lot of back and forth at every point, because sometimes you've gotten a great piece of footage, but there are resolution issues that just can't be surmounted, or it's too expensive, and then you go back and have to find something else that'll work. And there's also the issue of topics that just aren't covered well. You all had a luxury of a great topic and what seems like unlimited resources. Not quite true, but it's often the reverse, where you're doing a film on a subject that hasn't been covered by filmmakers or photographed much, and you have to be really inventive. So that requires a lot of collaboration as well, just brainstorming.
And get yourself a good entertainment lawyer.
Copyright lawyer too.
A lawyer that is well versed in copyright, license agreements, and being able to write a fair use agreement, a fair use opinion if you want to do fair use. You can't just use fair use and not have a legal opinion behind that. You have to have a written argument for every example of fair use or an orphan work, that your errors and omissions, you have to have insurance for your film as well. So it's very, very important that I would recommend that if you're a filmmaker who wants to start, that you get that lawyer lined up at the beginning of your production, not the end, and that you really vet materials that your filmmaker loves, or if you're the filmmaker yourself that you love, that, if you're going to fair use it, that you can set it up properly, or if it's an orphan work, that you do establish the amount of research that you need to qualify it for that opinion to be written. And also, license agreements are a beast. Every major vendor has their own license agreement and doesn't really necessarily like to have changes made to it, because they spent money on having that created. And then dealing with individuals that aren't really sure about signing an agreement or so forth, or what it encompasses, you need someone who can walk them through that process and hold their hand. So legal advice is really important in documentary filmmaking as well.
Okay, so I think we have still one clip to show. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful example of a sequence built entirely with archives. And then I let maybe Prue just talk a few minutes about it, and then we're going to have some questions. Enjoy.
So the excerpt that's on next is from I Am Not Your Negro. I was the U.S. archivist, and the film was produced in Paris by director Raoul Peck. So Raoul used an unfinished essay by James Baldwin as a starting point of an examination of race in America. And so he alludes to the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the violent and often deadly treatment of African Americans by the police. Baldwin had known all three murdered civil rights leaders, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And so his publishers had wanted him to write a book about it, and he just was unable to finish it. And that's where the film takes off. So what you're seeing is a chapter from the film called Paying My Dues. Oh, this film was really fascinating to work on. I've worked on a lot of films about African American history and American history, and I think Raoul did a great job of presenting things and letting the archive push the film in some cases. The old ads, even though they're from the 40s mostly, show you so you don't have to tell people things. They just present it visually. And the song is a well-known song, but coupled with which I remember hearing when I grew up in the South, but when coupled with some of the ads, I think it's just very, very powerful. And the photo of Dorothy Count, the young girl who goes to is sent to desegregated school in Charlotte, North Carolina by herself, which wasn't typically how it happened. That ended up in the Charlotte Public Library. It was taken by a great photographer. He did a whole series on her, and the collection went from the newspaper for whom he was working into the public library, so it was like a $40 photo. So you can never assume that all the stuff about African American history has been mined. There's always more stories that haven't been told yet. The other thing that came up with this film and with other films I've worked on is the importance of historical authenticity. If you're going to show footage of what people assume by the way you've cut the film is people marching in the Montgomery bus boycott in '56, you really want to have that footage. You don't want to, take something else and say it is, unless you've given the viewer some indication that it's not literal. I think we have that obligation, as journalists on certain types of films. And it sounds quaint in the context of today's treatment of the press, but it's more important than ever to maintain an honesty on how you use a piece of footage and how you present that footage. So that brings up the importance of metadata. Metadata is the information about the film or the photo, where it took place, the correct date, who's really in the picture. And that metadata is really critical when you're doing certain types of films and generally. And one of our pet peeves, I think it's safe to say, is YouTube, because YouTube is people putting stuff online without any metadata. So you don't know who owns it, what it is, who shot it. You don't know most of the information you need to, in fact, use it in your film. It's really helpful. YouTube is great as a place to see footage, see what's out there, and occasionally you can use it and clear it, but it's lacking a lot of the information that we need to be able to put it in a film. So that's about all on YouTube. It's sort of a pet peeve.
Yeah, or I just wanted to add, or the incorrect information. And or often it will say Creative Commons, which isn't true. So don't go using something just because it says Creative Commons.
Yeah, absolutely not. And also, that's why it's important to have an archivist or an archival producer or a researcher who does really have a good background in that material, so that, for example, let's say you fall in love with a clip of the Mike Douglas show that you find on YouTube. You just need to be aware that that's going to cost you $15,000 for 30 seconds. So you need to have that background going forward of yes, that material is available, but you need to have the budget for it. So just because it's on YouTube it's a great place to learn. A lot of times when I start up a project, the first thing I do is I go look for every single clip on that topic on YouTube just to make sure that I'm ahead of the game with what the director's going to throw at me. So I can, go, you can use this or you can't use that, et cetera. But YouTube is not a place to source from or as a general rule.
Thank you very much. I think we are right on time for questions, so feel free to ask.
Following up on what you just said, Well, so how to find the hidden gems, or how to find the hard to find material, basically, is the question. How you go about that. I mean, I usually my process usually is, learning the story, whatever the subject is, and reading and taking notes, and that's even taking notes on, where the subject was at a certain point in time, making notes on locations, making notes, if they performed somewhere. I know for the Grateful Dead, I mean, we knew every location that they ever performed in, and we tried to do our best in tracking down and finding local archives and, sourcing that way. So I think that, you really have to do your research and also, reading on who these people were friends with, if they had a camera, if they had a movie camera. So I think that all of those things are good starting points.
I'm going to just quickly switch. The Grateful Dead is such an enormous story, and their touring schedule is so surreal. I'm going to take it to another project just real quickly. I worked on an Elvis project that debuted, I think, last year, called Elvis a Searcher. And so primarily, we had a list of all of Elvis's tour dates in the 1950s, all the TV shows that he did. Most of those TV shows do exist, and then his tour dates in the 70s when he started touring again. And so basically, there was a finite number of things. So basically what I would do is just in terms of a deeper search rather than your normal general archives like the news archives or historic films or Reeling in the Years or so forth. I would go to every city that Elvis performed in, and I would search all the local universities, colleges, collections, all the public libraries, basically anyone that would have a photo or footage collection. And we found stuff that no one had ever seen before. It was kind of unbelievable that there was unseen Elvis footage, but there was. And it basically it's a lot of knocking on doors and searching through websites and just having the time. That's the other thing, is you need to have the time. So having the dedicated time when at the very beginning, basically to just explore the topic that you're working on, and figuring out all the different places that you can knock on that may be a little bit off the beaten path. Because a lot of people don't think, oh, I should check with the public library. Because public libraries have photo collections. A lot of times they've been donated a news film collection that's just sitting in a basement that no one even knows is there. That is where you're going to find your gems.
About news clips, I've been told by another archivist in a similar section that if you reproduce the news clip, you have to pay royalty. You have to deal with the newspaper itself. But if you reformat it with a different font, then you're okay. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Can you just repeat the question? I didn't help with that.
He asked if you can, I prefer not reformat, but recreate a newspaper or newspaper headline to take the place of actually licensing a legitimate newspaper or a magazine newspaper article or headline. Because newspaper is also print media is in desperate, not in great shape, basically, and the magazine world has completely fallen on its face. The prices for licensing newspapers and magazines now are really expensive, and in some cases just completely cost prohibitive. A New York Times headline will cost you a minimum of $1,500. It used to cost you $100. So just to give you an idea of how much the price has changed in the last 10 years. So a lot of times my suggestion is that you do recreate your newspaper articles and so forth. That's the decision the director has to make. It's just the advice that I often give filmmakers to save money. You can also potentially set it up for a fair use argument, but again, that's a legal decision and something you have to talk to your filmmaker about.
Yeah, there are a few caveats, but basically that's the story. The New York Times, for example, their masthead is copyrighted, the font. So you have to be careful with the Times, but it's just something that you need to double check on, But it's a ridiculous thing because this is news is supposed to be for the public good. You can also make that same fair use argument for some news clips, but there the challenge is that you have to find the footage from some source other than the original copyright holder to make a fair use claim. Yeah.
There's a photograph associated with the news clipping. Can you reformat or recreate this? Can you use that photograph, or is that out?
The question is, can you use the photograph if it's included in the newspaper? You have to clear the photograph. You can't just use it because the photograph is copyrighted separately from the layout of the newspaper. And it's almost impossible to fair use a photo because you're rarely using just a small portion of the entire thing. You're using the photo or you're not using the photo. So you would have to clear the photo normally.
Hi. Is there an official definition of fair use? Is there one definition, or are there many definitions of fair use with moving archival footage?
Yeah, there's acceptable. There's definitions there. I want to just point out there's something that was there's a graphic comic book, that's also online that was created by Duke University about 4 filmmakers on using licensing and fair use and public domain. It's called Bound by Law, and it's a really great. Gives a lot of illustrations of fair use. Basically, it's worth looking up online because it's very helpful. It's www.dukeupress.edu. But basically, there's in fair use, there are 4 criteria: the context of the use, the purpose and character of the use, and whether it's transformative in your film. What kind of a work it is, whether it's creative or factual information. Like if a reporter says it's 98 degrees today and it's a really hot day for the race, that's not creative. So you shouldn't have to worry about that. But if they're giving an opinion, that would be something you'd have to worry about. The amount and the amount of the work that you're using in proportion to the whole thing. Like we only used a small bit of Seinfeld in relation to the entire length of the show. And you have to be careful that your use is not going to undermine the copyright holder's ability to make commercial use of the piece. So, but that's...
The article was called Bound by Law.
Yeah, it's funny and it's well done. It holds up. It's online.
But also in regards to fair use, there's not like a rigid rule. It's not fast and steady. Also, it's also that's only in America that fair use is the law. In Canada and the United Kingdom, it's called fair dealings. There are some countries where there is no statute for fair use, and it's really up to a judge to decide if it qualifies as fair use if it ever gets to that point. And that goes back to the reason why you need to have a lawyer and you need to have errors and omissions insurance, because in most cases, if you fair use something and someone decides to come after you, your insurance is just going to pay that person off and take care of it rather than take it to court, because taking it to court can be too drawn out. There's very, very few instances of actually fair use court cases going to court. In most cases, those cases do win, but it's a very expensive venture.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this. Fair use is a defensive legal thing. It's not something you go into court to prove. The whole point is to stay out of court. And someplace like Disney often doesn't want to go to court either, because if they lose, they've established precedents. But
What kind of film that will use Chinese Cultural Revolution material, both video and posters? Posters were created by the government in 1966 and 76. So is that any kind of protection that we need to try to get a license? Now, some of these posters, I might add, I own posters. So we're using some of the posters out of my collection. But there's a range of material out there. So, what are you doing that?
I think you need to get a specialist researcher who actually understands what Chinese copyright is, because I'm not familiar with their statutes or how that works. But if it was an American poster, it would be copywritten and you would need to do the clearance for it. Whether you own a physical copy of something or not doesn't give you the copyright.
So, good analogy. So let's say it was a World War II sign-up
That would actually be an exception because government-produced materials are public domain. They're not allowed to be copywritten. That's just in the United States.
Also, if we found a piece of video that we couldn't identify an owner, you go on YouTube and you've seen lots of material. We've used some of it in our early trailers and just to show. So that's another case where we leave a copywriter in the table owner to give an opinion on the piece. If there's something we really wanted to use.
Yeah, so I would recommend getting, if you can, an archival researcher, or there's also somebody who does copyright checks. So we could provide that name. He works out of LA and he does copyright checks on very hard to find footage if you can't track down the copyright. But either way, whether you can, if he can't find the copyright owner, you would need a good lawyer to see how you're using the clip in context of the larger film to determine whether you can fair use it.
Is there another question?
Yeah, this is kind of a specific question, but maybe it applies to a lot of other situations. There's a piece of a documentary that I'm working on showing, we wanted to try to use it, and the documentary was made for academic purposes. And the guy who made it is like, he just doesn't respond. He doesn't possibly get in touch with it. But it was made through like Yale University a long time ago. They don't seem to claim it, so nobody's claiming it. It's kind of one of those orphan situations, but the guy's alive. So what do you do in a situation like that? Do you encounter something of that kind?
The first, you have a copy of the film?
It's online. It's been published by other, like a obscure anthropologist who said, hey, this is cool. I got like a scan of, somehow he got a video scan of it.
Does the film have a copyright notice?
It doesn't have anything like that. It was for academic purposes. It was never...
Normally what I would do with a situation like that is I would at least make a submission to the Library of Congress Copyright Office where you can hire a researcher. Not necessarily, it's easier to hire an outside researcher in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress to do a copyright search. That way you at least have a report so that you have there is no copyright. There's also, you'll get different opinions on this, and I don't want to make this overly complicated, whether it's a published work or an unpublished work. So if it's an unpublished work, it can still technically be copywritten without you knowing it because there is no notice. But I would do a copyright search first just to find out what is there any background there to find out what you're dealing with.
And just if the person is alive but doesn't make any claim or doesn't want to respond to any questions about it, you just...
That's going to be up to your lawyers to decide.
Yeah, sometimes we've sent a certified letter to show that we attempted to contact them. That's a good paper trail to have, no matter what. Yeah, just make the request and make sure you have some indication the person reasonably.
Due diligence is everything, and having that paper trail is just enormous when you're working with works like this. So it's like you want to be able to present the lawyer every single thing that you've done to present your argument on why you feel you can use this piece.
And Yale might own it if the person who made it worked for Yale. Universities often have a lot of control over what somebody produced while they were on the payroll.
Actually, I'm curious to ask about that. Is it possible to generalize about university archives? Do they tend to be, better organized, worse organized? They tend to be cheaper than a lot of other sources?
Yeah, do university libraries tend to be cheaper? They do tend to be cheaper and slower. But other than that, there's almost no generalization you can make about archives that holds true. They're all so different. But I often warn people to try to tackle some of the university libraries and public libraries first because they don't have the staff, and it takes them a long time to get back to you. But it's often, there's often great material. So, and it's usually cheaper. Yeah.
The other issue with university libraries I love, and public libraries as well. But the problem is that the majority of at least what I'm dealing with is primarily film, is they don't have any way to look at the film or even how to transfer the film. So a lot of times they'll have film cards, or if you're lucky, maybe they'll have a Steenbeck and they'll be nice enough to shoot it off their Steenbeck for you. But a lot of times you're going to have that money to, like if they have a film card, to have that film transferred. So there are some libraries now, universities that have really, the University of South Carolina, University of Georgia at Atlanta, University of North Texas, San Francisco State University, all have film transfers and amazing news film collections that are, after years and years and years of like kind of sitting in storage, are finally being processed and going up there. But you'd be amazed how many news film collections are just sitting in basements, because it's just not the assets to take care of them.
Yeah, and I think I would add, it's super important to, make a connection with the people who work at these archives, because I think just an email, I'm sure they get a lot more requests than they can handle sometimes. And it's like Prue and Jim said, they're short-staffed, and I think making a personal connection, calling them and explaining your project really helps, and can help speed along the process, and can help, I think just making a connection with the people too is it's always advised, and they can, sort of vouch for you and get things moving.
Okay, I think we have the time for a very last quick question. Sorry, you already asked one.
Could you talk a little bit about once the creator has died and the transfer of copyright, and does it transfer automatically to the family? How does that ownership kind of transfer over, and how do you kind of source that?
Did you?
I'm trying to think of an example of where I've run into that. In most cases, if a copyright is owned by an individual, then it would immediately just transfer in their will to their family members. I don't know. There's a very famous rock photographer named Jim Marshall. So his family now controls his estate of all his photographs, and he shot for the Grateful Dead and a million other people as well. So yes, the assets normally just, if it's an individual like that, the assets would be just turned over to the family with the copyright. I hope that answers your question.
I guess I was speaking more of something that wasn't famous, that it was like home movie footage, or something that's a little less, I guess, valuable in those terms, but.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want? I did face something like that on the Grateful Dead. Actually, this person wasn't famous, but was a friend of the Grateful Dead's early on in '67, and I was searching for him for months and months, maybe even like a year and a half. His name had been said incorrectly. I had different spellings of his name, and I finally found the right spelling. And it was just something that was always ongoing, this search for this individual. It turned out he had died homeless in Hawaii, but you kind of just have to be a good detective, and I found his daughters who had different names, but it's really, looking at public records that are available online and trying to find their children. So I found his daughters, and one was willing to license it to us. So, and just making that connection and calling, and making that personal connection is really important. And just being a good archival detective.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's like being a print journalist. You get very familiar with going through obits to try to figure out who might still be around, who might have known about the footage or the stills. We've done that a lot.